Today we have a presentation by Hara Macri, a PhD student from the Service Alliance, and she's going to talk about the critical incidents in complex service contracts, specifically in safety challenges and the mean prevention. Over to Hara.
Hello everyone, good afternoon, and thank you for joining our webinar. Today I'm going to talk about a recent study, a study we conducted in order to understand a bit more about how complex service contracts could affect safety within large service networks. Let me start by explaining what we mean by complex service contracts. This is an example you can find in the news. This headline specifically comes from Reuters. According to this article, Babcock and BAE Systems have won contracts to maintain British warships, submarines, and even naval bases, and has secured thousands of jobs across the UK. In cases like this one, manufacturers that decide to shift to services now have to deal with responsibilities that they didn't have to before. For example, they don't only have to maintain the ships, but also manage the whole base. They need to maintain buildings, provide accommodation, and even catering to employees within the base. In order to do this, manufacturers now have to work with different organizations, but in case that something goes wrong, they are still liable to their customer as prime subcontractors. If, for example, the catering company served bad food and a lot of people in base had food poisoning, the manufacturers could still be liable, even if they were not the ones that caused the incident. So in order to understand a bit more about how these large networks could potentially increase the risks for the servitized manufacturers, we first looked into the servitization literature to see whether we can draw any insights from there. What we found is that while there are a lot of studies that talk not only for the motives for both manufacturers and customers to turn into services, there are also studies that talk about the challenges and even the risks involved for manufacturers. These studies identify that there are risks involved and that some of these risks transfer from the customer to the manufacturer, but only focus on operational, performance, and financial aspects and have no direct focus in safety. So they provide no guidelines on how servitized manufacturers can improve or maintain the required safety levels and deal with any potential risks. So we also decided to look into the accident causation literature and see if we can draw some insights from there. What we found is a stream of literature that talks about organizations that cannot afford to fail, called the High Reliability Organizations literature, and provides us with a number of characteristics that these organizations need in order to achieve high levels of reliability. These characteristics include various different characteristics, either related with the overall safety culture, like culture for continuous learning, or other organizational competencies like outstanding technology, system and human redundancy, and you can see them all listed here on your screen. The problem with these studies is that they focus on single organizations, so we would need further evidence in order to be able to say that the same characteristics would actually work within a service environment. So based on this research from the literature, we decided to examine how servitized manufacturers can manage safety challenges given the large networks involved in service provision. As this is a relevant new topic area, we decided to use interviews in order to collect data with open-ended questions so that we could see the themes that would come up during the discussions. We conducted 23 interviews in total with people from organizations that either offer services or are partner organizations from servitized manufacturers, assigned in roles directly linked with safety, like, for example, safety engineers, product safety managers, and others. We mainly focused the discussions around the multidimensional aspect of services and its impact on managing the organization's accountabilities. You can see some examples of the questions we used listed on the screen. So in order to perform our analysis, we started as soon as the first data was collected by looking for emerging themes within the transcripts from the interviews and by adjusting the interview questions accordingly in order to incorporate any new themes that came up during the discussions in the questions. So we started by reading each transcript, highlighting any text where we could find challenges that the managers felt they were facing or ways they were using to manage them. And after working through the first transcript, we read the text more carefully and attempted to assign each highlighted text to a code. We did the same process over and over until all the transcripts were read and everything was assigned to a code. In cases that we could find a challenge that would not match the pre-existing code, then we would create a new one. This process resulted in an initial list of 286 references, all assigned against one or more codes. And after that, we created a very large mind map with over 286 references in order to be able to group them to their final categories and the concepts that would help us create the contextual framework as the guidance tool for servitized manufacturers. This is an illustration of the mind map we created in order to capture all the references during the discussions for assigning them into the categories and the concepts. But let's move on to our findings. On the screen, you can see the final categories that emerged from our analysis. This table reveals a number of interesting insights. First, we can see that some of the characteristics that we identified in the high reliability organizations literature, like human redundancy, standard procedures, communication issues, and culture of continuous learning, did not really attract much attention during the discussions. We also found that technology, also a characteristic identified by the high reliability organizations literature, although it was identified as a useful tool, at the same time, some of the respondents felt that outstanding technology can also increase the risk of failures due to the increased complexity it involves. We also found that culture seems to be an issue that very often concerns the interviewees, and that would be in different various forms, like the need for an overall just and safe culture within organizations, or issues that can arise from cultural differences within different organizations and others. As you can see here, about half of the respondents felt that a lot of the challenges arise from a general lack of control due to the large number of parties involved in services. And an example that can explain this a bit further comes from one of the interviewees. According to the respondent, their organization is responsible for training the customer's personnel to use the equipment they manufacture. As they mentioned, although it is the manufacturer's responsibility to provide the training, the level of training needed is under the customer's control. So if we think that organizations often face a battle between reducing costs and identifying acceptable levels of risk, there can often be a compromise on the level of training the customer is willing to pay for. What is more, these customers often are located outside the European Union, meaning that legislation does not necessarily provide any minimum health and safety requirements, and this could potentially compromise the quality of the working environment. So in the case of an accident within the customer's infrastructures, and although the manufacturer would have no control over them, the manufacturer would still be liable in the case of a working accident. Last but not least, most of the interviewees related many of the challenges they are facing with either organizational issues or a confusion over accountabilities. As one of the interviewees mentions, I don't think it will ever fully be defined of who is accountable and responsible for what within a service contract, and that is where we are putting our emphasis now in making people understand, which proves that even organizations who are already offering services are still trying to find the right way to do this. Like I mentioned earlier, we wanted to provide a contextual framework that can assist servitized manufacturers face the identified challenges, and all 286 references that were identified from the interviews were regrouped again to form some wider characteristics. According to the suggested framework, servitized manufacturers first need to clearly understand the wider context in which every partner and customer operates. This context depends not only on the size of each firm, but also on the sector and country in which the partners operate. To explain this a bit more, some of the interviewees mentioned that in bigger organizations, often people assume that someone else is responsible for doing a certain job and therefore fail to take proper actions. On the other hand, in smaller organizations, people are willing to take on even more responsibilities. But the problem is that smaller organizations don't have the experience or the pockets, as someone specifically mentioned, in the event that something does go wrong. And as a result, organizations are often more careful when it comes to including smaller firms in their networks. At the same time, each sector can have different approaches to safety and different acceptable levels of risk. For example, the acceptable level of risk in military environments is different than civil ones. So as one of the interviewees explains, in military, the trade of safety versus performance is part of the trading space as we are dealing with weapons. And last but not least, in developing countries with less available resources, people tend to be more creative in order to complete certain tasks, and that could increase the risk of accidents. Now, within this wider context, we identify three main characteristics that servitized manufacturers should consider in order to sustain a high level of safety. The first characteristic is related to this general lack of control that I described earlier. According to the responses, a lot of these issues can arise from the large number of parties involved in service networks and depends on which entity has the right to govern at each point in time. So it is very important within the network to have a clear governance and well-defined accountabilities and a unified incident reporting system to promote a culture of continuous learning. Within this category, we identify three main subcategories. The first one refers to the procedures that exist within the partners. According to the interviewees, procedures determine the way things are done and drive behaviors. The second one refers to the general structures and hierarchies that exist within the network. Organizations will need to look for partners who have designated safety managers and safety management systems, but these need to be independent from commercial departments. This is very important since safety managers need to be able to put a project on hold if they think that something is not right. For the third and last subcategory, servitized manufacturers will need to consider the legislation under which their partners and customers operate. While this is not something that can be affected, it provides important information for setting up the processes and communication paths between the partners. In more detail, legislation is important as it determines the acceptable levels of risk, like we mentioned earlier with the example in military. It determines the requirements for safety management and incident reporting systems and the requirements for any ISO and health and safety requirements. The second characteristic refers to the attitudes that exist within the service network. Organizations need to consider all the individual people involved within the network, as their personal attitudes and values can affect the way that everyday processes are performed. Servitized manufacturers need to have a clear understanding of this in order to find a way to drive the right behaviors, and this requires a better understanding of the personal cultures of the individuals involved. Again, while this may not be an issue that is unique to services, more differences are expected to arise within these complex service environments. These differences could come from an individual's country of origin, religious beliefs, and professional background. An example here, when considering safety for an individual's comes from the individual's professions. For example, high esteemed professions like doctors are often discouraged from incident reporting due to fear of revealing flaws in their professional competence. So in order to be able to deal with these differences efficiently, servitized manufacturers need to have a clear understanding of all these. The next level highlights the importance of a joint and aligned incentive system across the whole service network. This is because incentives drive behaviors and will need to be linked to a just culture, otherwise they can bring the opposite results. The problem here is that safety is hard to measure, and as one of the respondents mentioned, it is the safety message that tends to get watered down because it is not what pays people's wages. And this brings us back to the issue of finding the right balance between cost and safety. And the last level within this category that highlights that there is a constant tension between commercial and operational functions of organizations. For example, as one of the interviewees points out, product-based organizations have less things to consider compared to service-based organizations, since the service-based organizations need to consider the support of a product for the next 10, maybe even 20 years. Even when changing from different service contracts, so from a maintenance support contract to a through-life support contract, these could lead to changes in culture. In maintenance contracts, the supplier benefits from replacing as many parts as possible, when in through-life support contracts, the service provider prefers to reuse as many as possible. Even within the same company, if we think the different departments, so for example, procurement versus engineering, there's always a constant battle between conflicting accountabilities. So procurement needs to source cheaper parts, and engineering has to provide the customer with safer products. And not surprisingly, we can see here that most of these categories are closely linked. So this tension between commercial and operations is the way why we mentioned earlier that safety managers need to be independent from commercial managers in order to be able to take proper actions when required. The third and last characteristic that requires attention is related to the competencies within the whole network. So manufacturers need to consider the competency of the employees along with the assessment and training the partners provide for them. Competent people are required for the successful and safe delivery of the service, but at the same time, they need to be continually assessed and developed in order to have a clear understanding of their accountabilities. Even in cases where all the accountabilities are clearly explained and presented in the service contracts, they still need to be reviewed constantly and understood on a case-by-case basis. Last but not least, the technology and systems available within every partner need to be clearly understood and considered. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of interviews linked complex technology with increased risk, but at the same time, it was recognized that technology can be a useful tool that can clarify accountabilities, drive behaviors, improve everyday communication, and as a result, maintain a high level of safety. To conclude, with this research, we aimed to provide a guidance tool for servitized manufacturers to deal with the challenges that can arise within the complex service networks and link the servitization literature with the accident causation literature. So we provided a guidance tool where we identified three main characteristics that manufacturers will need to have a clear understanding of, but we need further evidence in order to be able to say that the high liability organization characteristics would also work in services. As a relevant new topic area, this was an exploratory research, so its main target was to provide leads for further research and suggest new propositions. And therefore, we plan to continue this research and supplement our analysis with past critical failures by using interviews and analyzing the official investigation reports of accidents. You can find the full paper on the Cambridge Service Alliance website, or simply scan the code that you can see here on the left. And you can now ask any questions, or you can email me directly for more questions, or if you want to participate in our study. Thank you.